Hello again, I'm Jai Tanninen. Thanks for joining us here on the Art Apprenticeship Society of Alberta's YouTube channel. I'll be guiding you through this series of videos teaching you about the basics of acrylic painting. Today we'll be focusing on teaching you how to make different textures with acrylic paint. Okay, so for textures, first thing you're going to need is a cloth to wipe your wet brush on. As part of cleaning, I use old paper towels that I used for Windex previously. They last a while, it's a good way to reuse them. A cup full of clean water, you can rinse that out as many times as you like. Brushes, of course, and the main thing, which is paint. Different kinds of paint inherently have different kinds of textures. You can get anything from the dollar store craft paints, which are really nice. They're usually quite matte and leave an even matte finish. You can use a little bit heavier paint, which has more body and can give you thicker, more textured results. And then next to that, you can use a gel medium. This is a super heavy gel medium, and I'll show you how to use that in just a little while. This is a gloss finish. You can also get matte and medium gloss. What I might start with for textures is just getting used to your brush, especially if you're a beginner. Pick a brush that you just feel comfortable with, maybe nothing too big or too small. And then I am going to get a palette. In this case, it's the back of an old book that I plan on painting on later, so don't worry about it. It was a Reader's Digest that nobody wants to read anymore from like 1976. So I'm using the craft paint, which, like I said, is it's a matte finish. It is a nice even color. Sometimes it can be a little thin, so when you put the color down like that, it looks very saturated, that nice light lavender purple. When it dries, some of the liquid will dry out of it, and then you might see some of the texture of the canvas through it. And then you just put another coat on top, and you can get a different texture, more even and matte. So another thing that you can do with this paint and your brush is practice making little marks, almost like stippling, almost like impressionism. Try using different angles from your brush. If you use the flat side, it's something like that, which you might want for texture. If you use the narrow side, it kind of leaves more saturated blobs. Another texture that you can play around with, I'm going to use the same lavender craft paint, is to water it down. You can water it down quite a bit, because you can always add more to it. And it needs more water. But try and get a really thin application, a wash. It can almost give like a watercolor effect, depending on what you're doing, but it will show a lot of the texture of the canvas through underneath. And as it dries, it'll tend to even out, but you'll see in a minute how that can really show a very thin texture. And this could be good if you're layering colors. For example, if you put this purple down and you wanted it to be a little lighter, or you wanted to blend it in with, let's say I have a light ultramarine blue here, which is one of my favorite colors, but when it's wet you can sort of mix that in, and because it's really, really wet, the particles of the pigment blend together really nicely, and you can kind of add texture within the wet parts, which definitely has a lot of applications. You can kind of see or possibly imagine that maybe that's the top of a tree. It could be maybe hair. Maybe there's like a little mouth. Eye, nose, and a little abstracted person. As that dries, it'll definitely spread out a little bit. The pigments will lighten once the liquid comes out of there. But with a really watered down paint, you can get some interesting washes, and if you play around with that, you might find some interesting applications. So I took a moment to clean up my water because I didn't want the color of the water to affect the colors that I was using in my next paint application. That can happen sometimes. Sometimes it can muddle your colors if you want to try and separate your colors and make sure they're not too blended for whatever specific reason. Change your water often. So I'm switching to a smaller brush. I'm dipping it in water to kind of just keep the brushes together initially. And the next texture that I want to show you is stippling. So there's a whole impressionistic-ish genre, sort of related to the Impressionists, called pointillism, and it's very descriptive of what it is in its own name, and it's just making little points. It always reminds me of in old comic books when you look up close and there'd just be like a layer of little dots, like little orangish pink dots with white in the background. If you zoom out, usually makes Caucasian skin tones and something like Archie comics, and you can continue to add these. I'm going to add a few more and then come back and I'll show you a larger field. So I made the field a little larger. I overlapped it with the purple textures that we started with, and I'm going to show you what you can do with just layering different textures and different colors over top. So we have sort of like very painterly, loose-ish texture, varying textures with the purple, a bit more careful, deliberate points with the pointillism. And then if you wanted to blend that, I'm just taking an orange, going back to the matte technique, and I'm just painting on top of that. And I think that the blend of textures is a good contrast, and you can definitely play around with different color combinations and try and contrast the textures. One thing you really want to do with smaller brushes, see this is a very fine point, is make sure that you don't leave that sitting in water. These ones will definitely get a bit too worn too quickly. The bristles will fray. So what I'm going to do is just run it under the sink, really thoroughly rinse it, and then leave it on the sink to dry in a point. Okay, so if we're going back to a bit of a larger brush, we can use the heavier bodied paint. So the purple was a craft paint, the blue and the orange were a heavier body, more artist quality paint. So I'm going to take the heavier body, this time a cadmium red, and I'm going to put, a good amount on my brush. And if you kind of just take it and scrape it off to one side, it'll give you that edge right there. If you wanted to, you can kind of blend that out and again mix the textures. But that edge there, because it's a heavier bodied paint, will dry like that. You can just let it sit and it will dry. And as I'm doing this, another kind of texture you can do, going back to the wash, is you can get your brush nice and wet and kind of bring that color that exists out there and blend that outwards. And that gives you a different texture as well. So for the next application, I'm just really drying my brush because we are going to try dry brush texture. So I'm going to take, let's go with the orange again. And I'm going to hold the canvas steady because there's not as much liquid in the brush to prevent friction. So it might just make the canvas wriggle around a lot. So holding it steady. And then you take the dry brush, and what happens there is the bristles will separate because they're not held together by as much moisture, but the pigment is still on there. So it'll unevenly distribute the pigment from the brush, and you can see a little bit more about what the brush actually does. This is where I started, heavy saturation, and then the sides of the brushes come out and make those kinds of textures. And you can definitely play around with that a bit more and expand on it and see what you like about it. If you don't like anything about it, fine, but if you do, you can work with it and see what it can do for you. So sometimes the paint themselves can come with different textures. You can get paint that is different viscosities to fit different heaviness. In this case, it's metallic paint. This is a iridescent gold. I really like iridescent paints. I find they're beautiful, but it's kind of hard to find different applications for it depending on what your practice is or what you're trying to accomplish. But I really like expanding on the pointillism technique, but with the paint and just using it straight out of the tube. Especially in the metallic paint in this case, but you can do it with any kind of thicker paint that comes in a tube, is make these little points. It reminds me very much of something like icing. And I think that can look really cool to add some texture in different parts of paintings as you desire. Sometimes it's really fun if you don't want to frame a painting, you can kind of put it along the sides. You have to be careful how it dries. Do a little bit at a time and let it dry thoroughly, which takes several hours with acrylic paint, but it can set enough so that the outside is stable and the inside is a bit liquid still, but you can eventually do it around the outside, and it gives this interesting border if that's something that you might be interested in. Again, working out of the tube, this time I'm going to use an Ultramarine Violet. You can use the paint sort of as drawing. If you want to really go through your paint quite quickly, this is something that you can do. And you just, as you'd imagine, just squeeze it out and draw with it. So if you don't apply an even squeeze, which definitely takes some practice, you will get breaks like that. In this case, that's a happy accident, kind of like it. So I will just leave it like that. And it is also a heavier texture. It's definitely raised maybe a millimeter and a half off of the canvas surface, just like the red was there. And then there's the super heavy gloss gel medium. So this is similar to the paint that's in the tubes, but it will keep its volume as you lay it down. So I'm using a palette knife, which is always fun to use. And if I make a little mountain of that, which I'll leave there, you can see the shadow of how high that's raised up. And if you just leave that and let it dry, it will keep that shape. If it keeps that shape, you can then paint over it as an armature for more paint to go on top of. But that is a really good way to add lots of texture to your canvases. This palette has seen a lot of work lately, so I'm just gonna clean it off. I don't usually wash them because it doesn't really matter. I don't paint directly with them, but it's great for scooping out thicker paints. And that was creating textures with acrylic paint. I hope you found that helpful. Thank you for joining us today, and you can find me on Instagram at Jai Tanninen, and you can find the Artmanship Society of Alberta at AMSA_Graham. Thanks a lot. I hope you have a good day.